Thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleased to be with you.
Mr. Celik, you're the head of Governor Romney's National Security Transition Team and have spoken in the past about how you think the World Bank can leverage its position to pressure Ahmadinejad and Iran away from developing a nuclear program. Can you speak a bit to your view of the synergies between nations and international institutions with respect to situations like this?
Well, I don't know if there's a lot that the World Bank can do with Iran, to be frank. I think that's a different set of issues. There's clearly a policy through the UN of economic sanctions and also through the United States Congress. But I think there's a very big open question about whether those sanctions are likely to press the regime to try to negotiate with others to try to end the nuclear program. So I think where the World Bank fits more in the security picture is more in countries that have been facing conflict or coming out of conflict. So the Liberias, the Cote d'Ivoires, the Sierra Leones, the Afghanistan. And there where the World Bank can play a constructive role is in trying to interconnect security, economics, and governance. And when I came to the World Bank, I tried to highlight these topics which were popularized in a book called The Bottom Billion by Paul Collier, an economist at Oxford. Because what I saw from my past government experience was that these security, economic, and governance communities tended to work on their own template and not try to see the interconnections, and yet this is a natural multidisciplinary problem. And so one of the bank's World Development Reports was actually focused on this topic to try to advance the state of knowledge, see the experience of what worked and what didn't. And one of the initiatives we created was a hub in Nairobi, which we at the World Bank Group used to try to have experts in the field of dealing with post-conflict and fragile situations to support our country teams, but also to help develop some of the knowledge that flows from it. And so one of the things that I was trying to encourage was, as part of a broader knowledge and learning agenda, to take our operational experience and try to interconnect it with work. For example, King's College in London is doing some work in this area, and obviously it'd be interesting to see some of the work at Harvard and see how we could interconnect that too.
Sure. Great. So then, as president of the World Bank, you pioneered what you call the goal of an inclusive and sustainable globalization. And I'm wondering, under your tenure, of course, capital stock increased, the Horn of Africa famine was alleviated, the corporate governance of the bank was reformed, and the influence the institution had in emerging economies really grew. I'm wondering what you think about what specific steps world leaders like the United States, China, Russia, Japan, India, etc. can take today to facilitate the mission of the World Bank Group further.
Well, I tend to look at the World Bank Group and a lot of these international institutions in their historical context. The World Bank was first created in 1944, and that year tells you something because World War II was still going on. But Britain, the United States, other countries decided that they needed to avoid some of the economic problems of the 20s and 30s that led to a world conflict. And so whether it be the World Bank, which was focused first on reconstruction and development, whether it is the question of the IMF and its role in terms of overall monetary and macroeconomic stabilization for the trading system, one of the challenges is how do you modernize and upgrade these institutions for the new challenges? So we talked about conflict states. So in 1944, the I in International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which was the formal name of the World Bank, stood for Europe and Japan. Today it stands for Afghanistan and some of the countries in Africa and elsewhere. So when you asked about support, I think there's a role of the bank to be able to be a catalyst within a network, and this is what has very much changed from the world of mid-20th century, is you now have much more private sector capital, you've got NGO and civil society community, you've got a large amount of research, and how the World Bank can play a catalytic role bringing together knowledge and learning, finance, but to strengthen institutions and capacity. And what is most important, I think, is to recognize is the changing nature of strength in the international economy. So what had been 20 years ago, the trilateral system of the U.S., Japan, and Europe has now had the emerging powers play a key role. And so one of the core challenges for the bank will be how to continue to serve the rising middle-income countries, the Chinas, the Indias, and Brazils, while also drawing them in. So when you talk about how they can contribute in part, they've invested in the capital of the bank, and then we're a AAA borrower, borrowed on international markets. There's a contribution for the 79 poorest countries called IDA, which has to be raised every 3 years, and obviously that is increasingly difficult unless you get support from a broader range of countries. But a lot of what is important with development now is also having sound policies for Europe and the United States to grow, having open trade markets, supporting the flow of investment, doing away with subsidies that are unfair and stop developing countries' ability to compete. So part of the changing nature of the international economy since 1945 has to be reflected in the bank's operations and how the bank serves those shareholders.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm wondering, sir, can you comment a little bit on Secretary Clinton's time at the helm of the State Department as a policy leader, and what are some policy issues you might emphasize differently if you were Secretary of State today, given your experiences in the field of foreign relations? Specifically, what would you do to enable the United States to leverage its position more effectively in the world with respect to soft power, which, as you know, is a favorite concept of HKS Professor Joe Nappy?
Well, the topic that I've come up to speak about at the JFK Forum and had some faculty seminars about is the interconnection of economics and security. And my background in foreign policy is a little different from many of my contemporaries who came up more through the political military side or studies of the Soviet Union and the Cold War or Middle East. And while I've dealt with those issues, I tended to come from an economics experience working with the Treasury Department, being the trade representative. And so what I'm trying to encourage in the thinking of foreign policy, including for the State Department, is how one can effectively integrate economics as a dynamic process in your larger foreign policy agenda. This is everything from resources and power to the fact that healthy economies are going to be important for modern political systems, and one has tended to see that economic reforms over time have been associated with democratic development. It'll be important today for some of the traditional allies of the United States, the Eurozone. And one of the great achievements of the past 60 years was the ending of conflict among European countries, their integration, but that is partly at risk with the questions about the future of the Eurozone. So in some ways, sometimes there's a debate in foreign policy about idealism and realism and power. I find that economics is actually a way that can engage both those topics, because the economic agenda focuses on private sector, freedom, liberty, openness, obviously growth, opportunity, but at the same time it's important for fundamental basis of power. So last week I was in Singapore, Taiwan, and Korea. Anyone who spends any time in East Asia recognizes that economic strength and dynamism is the coin of the realm. This is a sense of one's future. So for the United States to be able to lead as well as compete effectively, we have to start by fixing problems at home. And that also goes to some of the issues that I've been talking about in the case of the fiscal cliff and the likely budget issues that will carry over into 2013. And I'll share with you an observation that I'm repeating in the speech that came from the Australian Foreign Minister Bob Carr, longtime friend of the United States. When he visited the United States earlier this year, he said something that really resonated. He said, the United States is one budget deal away from restoring its global preeminence. And that was striking, because what he's partly saying is it's not only a question of getting your financial house in order, but it's also showing that your political system works and that your political system can deal with the challenges of the day. But he added one other point, which was to say, be aware that there are countries and people in his part of the world, the Asia Pacific, that are saying this time the United States isn't up to it. this time the United States isn't going to be able to fix its problems,
Yeah.
so you better listen to our interests. So it's a way of demonstrating how what sometimes looks like domestic economic issues are also fundamental to a country's not only economic strength, but its political leadership.
Great. So, Mr. Zoellick, your views have been described by some critics as more mercantilist and unilateralist than free trader oriented or multilateralist. Do you think this is a fair characterization? And in a post-Bretton Woods II world, what are your views on international currency flows, especially with respect to perhaps a renewed gold standard?
Well, those are two very different questions. First, I don't think the mercantilist charge is at all accurate. I think I negotiated more free trade agreements for the United States by 4 or 5 times than all my predecessors or successors. What that, I think, emanated from was the strategy that I took as U.S. Trade Representative was to push what we called competitive liberalization. So we were pushing bilaterally, regionally, and globally. So I was the person who actually, after the failure in Seattle in 99 and 2000, relaunched the global trade round and got it back on in 2001 and got it back on track in 2004. And I still believe that there's a chance to salvage that round, although it's fading fast. So I'm a big believer in the multilateral trade system. But one of the problems with that negotiation reflects this point I mentioned about rising powers, because as the advanced economies that by and large had generally opened their markets over the past 50 years, felt the competition from the rising powers. They wanted the rising powers to share a greater load in the international trading system by opening their markets, the Brazils, the Indias. China had actually, in its accession, had lower barriers than Brazil and India. And then together, they need to help the poorest in Africa. So that was one of the challenges of the global round. But I also made the point that the United States shouldn't be stuck. So if we didn't move ahead with a global agenda, we needed to move ahead with those who were willing to liberalize. And the result of that is that if you look at the Western Hemisphere, the United States now has free trade agreements with over 50% of the hemisphere's GDP, not counting the United States. And so this includes Chile and Colombia and Peru and Central America and Panama. And that actually is important in not only U.S. relations, but in also shaping the outlook, because when the U.S. does free trade agreements, they're more comprehensive, so they cover investment, intellectual property, a series of other issues. But it's an important distinction, because there was a school of thought that said the bilateral and regional interfere with the multilateral. Interestingly enough, the World Bank and others had done a lot of research on this topic and found it wasn't the case. In fact, what one found is, not surprisingly, the countries that are willing to liberalize bilaterally or in regional context would really be the strongest proponents of trying to do so globally, because this was a way in which they would mobilize their own political forces for more open, competitive economies.
Right.
Now, you asked about currencies and gold, and this stems from the fact that I wrote a piece in the Financial Times a year or two ago, and I was talking about the need to shift thinking about the international currency system. And in reality, one of the things I was talking about was how, for example, the G7 advanced economies should have a principle of floating exchange rates, except in the condition where others would agree on intervention. And this is one of the issues that Japan has raised. And then I talked about, for middle-income countries, how you wanted to move them towards this system. But the reference to gold was that we're in an era where monetary policy is moving into sort of new territory, and people are taking bold steps. And I'm not necessarily hostile to it, but I'm suggesting that it's important to look at what markets signal. And so my background, in addition to policy, has been market orientation. And so what markets, through the price of gold, and this is also the case of some other commodities, but depends on supply and demand, was some level of discomfort with what they saw the central bankers were doing with fiat money, with paper money. Now, not surprisingly, the central banking community doesn't like to be criticized. They don't like to have a fair question. But the nature of this debate, since I wrote this piece, has not gone away. So if you think about the debate about QE3 in the United States, this is a symptom of that debate. So in that sense, my view was gold was useful as an indicator of confidence at a time that you were pursuing very unusual monetary policies. And check out the price of gold today. I think it tells you that.
$1,600, $1,700 an ounce, right? So, Mr. Zoellick, finally, your career has spanned finance, government, law, academia, politics, international relations, and more. As a Harvard alumnus with such a diverse career and array of experiences, what advice do you have for Harvard students like us hoping to make a difference on such a large scale?
Well, career choices really depend very heavily on the individual. And so I think one has to be wary of any generalized suggestions. I would, I guess, start by saying that anybody who has the good fortune to go to school at Harvard, either undergraduate or graduate, has a wonderful world of opportunity open to them. And I hope whatever they do, that they draw the most from it, and whether it's in a profession, a business, whether it relates to colleagues, academia, that they use it. It's Cambridge and Harvard is a place renowned around the world for the mixture of people and ideas, and that it's able to draw. And in the time since I was here, the student body has only been more deeply enriched through the international components. I was talking with one of the deans last night at the Kennedy School that said that over half the students are international, which is a tremendous opportunity. Beyond that, I would just say that sort of two thoughts. One is, I did a joint degree with the law school and the public policy school, in part because I felt that service to country and to the public was important, and I wanted to learn more about the skills, both analytical and managerial, to try to do that. And I think that that remains the case. So I hope that people, again, there are different walks of life, different callings, but I hope that people continue to look at that as a potential avenue for public service, which I still think is the highest calling.
Sure.
But then third, I guess on a more practical side, what I found for my career and then some of my contemporaries is at times you're going to have to make calculated risks, judgments. So people will often start, in my case, people would start in law firms or in businesses or maybe consulting firms or others. And it's easy to follow that path, and there's a lot you can learn there, and there's a lot you can contribute there. But now and then there'll be an opportunity that will involve a certain amount of risk. Maybe it's working for an elected official, maybe it's going into a government policy position. And sometimes one has to assess that given your own life and family and other sort of calculations. I would just suggest that now and then you have to make some of those calculated risks. And my experience has been, but this varies, is that the greater variety of experiences you have, the broader base that you have, as you mentioned, economic, finance, law, and others, it actually enriches your perspective. So when people have asked me what I do, I tend to see myself as a problem solver, and I try to bring to the task of solving problems multiple disciplines. So when I was president of the World Bank and I was thinking about challenges, it was in part to understand the analytical basis, but it's also the organizational, the communications, the constituency, the role of your shareholders, the kind of the leadership aspects. So I have a hard time thinking of problems in a unidimensional sense. That's partly my background. But I think there are different ways that people can pursue those careers, and I personally found that the more perspectives you can bring to bear, that often helps with qualitative analysis that supplements quantitative analysis, with one caveat. Sometimes if people take on lots of information, they can get paralyzed, and that will be the death of a decision maker, because ultimately you have to decide. And so you live in a world of imperfect information, as they teach you at the Kennedy School and at Harvard, and so part of the challenge is knowing how much is enough and how much is to rely on others, because inaction also can become a form of action.
that note, do you know where your own career may take you next? Perhaps
No,
government?
no, I've been very fortunate, and so I may, or depending on the course of events, have another chance to serve in the U.S. government. I'm a senior fellow here at the Belfer Center, and I'm trying to do some research and writing on some of these tasks. But I also continue to do some things in the financial sector. I'm doing some public speaking. So I left the bank in June 30th, and in part to avoid conflicts, and in part just to have a better perspective on what to do next. I thought I'd wait more until the end of the year to decide what combination of activities or prime focus I should have. So let me know if anything good pops up.
Will do. Mr. Zoellick, do you have anything else to add?
Just thanks for doing it.
Thank you so much. We
Appreciate
look
it.
forward
Good
to
luck.
the speech tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.